Madam Chair, I will begin to call the roll with Chair Moore.
Present.
Chair Moore is present. Member Grills? Member Grills is present. Member Bradford? Member Bradford is present. Member Holder? Member Holder is present. Member Lewis? Present. Member Lewis is present. Member Montgomery Stepp? Here. Member Montgomery Stepp is present. Member Tamaki? Present. Member Tamaki is present. Madam Chair, the task force consists of 9 members. There are 7 members present. In order to have a quorum, one must have 5 members present. A quorum has been established.
Thank you, Parliamentarian Johnson. Now that a quorum has been reestablished, we will return to the agenda. The next item on the agenda is item number 19. Discussion and action item, task force approval of draft report, part 6, policy recommendations to the legislature regarding appropriate policies, programs, projects, and recommendations for the purpose of reversing the injuries.
Chair Moore, should I?
Attorney Newman, you're recognized.
Okay. Thank you very much. So this next period of the meeting is to go through sort of the heart of the final report, which is the discussions about policy changes and different implementations that would affect a non-repetition. So this is part of the international standards for for reparations. Sorry. You all have seen several occasions the variety, the plethora of different policy recommendations through numerous circulations of outlines. Each of you, these represent the combined work of each of your advisory committees over the period of several months. You've voted on essentially all of these recommendations to move forward, again, along the way, giving direction and clarification to the DOJ staff that are drafting them. And what you see now in the draft form is essentially the narrative of these chapters. It's chapters 18 through 30, which generally speaking correspond to what will become chapters 1 through 13, which are essentially republished from what was the interim report. Just to cover a couple of high-level points, first and foremost, we talked about the Racial Justice Act yesterday. The Racial Justice Act data and findings underlie several of the different policy recommendations that are sort of sprinkled throughout the report, but specifically in the unjust legal system chapter, which you discussed and voted on yesterday. The other major component is the discussion about the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency. We had a long discussion about this in the last meeting, and so what you all see now fleshed out is the more fulsome discussion about the agency, and we, following your instructions in the last meeting, delineated where the agency would be directly responsible for items versus where the agency would be overseeing other items. I'll note a couple of things. The language that we utilized was informed by the various advisory committees, and different advisory committees took different approaches in developing the recommendations. You have voted to advance the recommendations, but obviously there was a vote earlier today about the use of the words African American, so we will implement that in the final draft on the policy changes. And then, generally speaking, we've had several discussions as a task force. You all have given direction on a number of occasions about different formulations of recommendations with regard to who would be covered by the different recommendations. So we've carried through the direction we've gotten on those points into the final recommendations. So now for your discussion, feedback, questions, are the recommendations, and we can either go chapter by chapter, or if you just want to sort of start talking about, actually, maybe we'll go chapter by chapter. I think that'll be a better organization. So why don't we start with Chapter 18? That's the introduction and overarching recommendations, which includes the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency, the repeal of Prop 209, conducting racial impact analyses, agency transparency, and legislative findings. Does anybody have any questions or feedback about any of the contents of the Chapter 18 introduction and recommendations? There are no. Okay.
Member Grills, you're recognized.
So I have a few copy edits that are not any content changes, just kind of typos that I can give to DOJ. So I won't go through those now. But I do think that I wanted to just note, based on the original discussion, a couple of, 2 task force meetings ago, where we said the idea of the agency is not problematic, but the scope and scale of the agency, it was recommended that that be scaled back. And so when we got to the version in our early March meeting, I didn't see evidence of any scaling back per se. So now in this version, I'm still seeing all of these branches still noted, an education branch, a social services branch, a medical services branch, labor and employment branch, development branch, legal affairs branch, community-based organization branch. So it's almost like the idea that where there are community-based organizations that could do the work, they're already doing the work, they have a trusted relationship with the community, that has kind of been tasked to a item 7, a branch that's just going to deal with the community-based organizations, but it's disconnected from each of the areas that are being proposed as branches. So I'm still not seeing the scaling back that we as a task force voted on 2 meetings ago.
Attorney Newman, do you want to respond to that?
Sure, yeah, we work to try to do some of that. I think the feedback that we can take from this is we can further do that and maybe make it more generalized and leave it for the legislature to make ultimate decisions on exactly how to organize the agency. And we can implement those changes just to say that these are the things that they should be carrying out, but not necessarily creating all the different branches.
Okay.
Are there any, I know part of the issue there is what specific work should the agency be doing? And I think we hopefully struck the balance that reflects the conversation that we had. But what we can do is, you don't see anything that you see us having us laid out that the agency is going to be doing. It's just a matter of the organization of the branches. So we'll work with you more, and obviously we'll have some more time to work through a draft, and we can check in with you to make sure that if we sort of remove out the branches but still maintain the workload, it'll still reflect it, and then the legislature will make a final decision. Okay?
I just need some clarity because I'm not sure, Dr. Grills, if you know, but I didn't actually revise what's actually presented. It was the California DOJ who revised all of this based on what they heard and what was voted on not 2 meetings ago, but our most immediate past meeting. And I actually think they struck the necessary balance. That's an accurate reflection of not what was decided 2 meetings ago, but what was decided at our most immediate meeting.
So I guess that the last meeting seems to have lent itself to a broad interpretation of scaling back. Because the concern that led to the very lengthy discussion was that the scale of the agency was too much. And that there was an agreement, is my understanding of what was said, was that where there are existing entities doing the work, that they would then be tasked with making sure that the medical or the, whatever the different categories, the medical, the social services, et cetera, where there are existing entities, whether they be state entities or community-based organizations, that there would be an effort to ensure that those entities would do the work with the agency monitoring and ensuring compliance with the expectation of those services. Not that the agency would still task itself with being a medical arm, a legal arm, a social services arm, an education arm, a labor and employment arm. That just seems like it's just too much.
Not going to go back and forth, but I do think the California DOJ did what was appropriate, which was listen to what was voted on, and that is reflected accurately in this draft. If you read page number 5, the California DOJ stated exactly what was voted on at our most immediate hearing, which is, when African Americans are not an exclusive focus of reparative policies and programs throughout history, they invariably end up at the back of the line and receive proportionally less of the benefits than others. In order to ensure that this time is different and that there will be focus on efforts flowing from the work of this task force, we recommend the legislature create an agency that is exclusively dedicated to descendants' interests and needs. Complex new functions will be needed to implement the task force's recommended reparation scheme, including determinations of eligibility and administration of payments and other new programs that are part of the monetary component of the task force recommendations. Additionally, as discussed below, the task force recommends that the legislature provide such an agency with an oversight role in ensuring existing state agencies properly implement the legislative enactments resulting from the task force recommendations, where those recommendations fall within the scope of those existing agencies' authorities. Finally, there will be a need in some instances for such an agency to provide direct services to fill gaps or augment existing services to ensure that the descendants' needs are fully met, free of bias, delay, or neglect. That is an accurate depiction of what we voted on earlier this month.
So just to
Maki, you're
clarify.
recognized.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Unless I'm not reading this right. I think the key language is the bottom of page 5. I mean, I'm satisfied with the way it's written, but if task force members or the DOJ have any other suggestions. But I think the bottom of the paragraph says, when not acting directly in furtherance of the recommendations of this report, the agency should be authorized to engage in oversight and monitoring of those state agencies. And the next to the last sentence says this oversight and monitoring should include at least the following. And then there's a listing of these entities that are delivering. So unless I'm missing something, I think that basically, states that the Freedmen's Bureau is not going to take the place of these massive infrastructure that already exists, including CBOs, but would basically have some oversight and monitoring. Was that your view, Michael, or?
Yeah, and I think what I would encapsulate this as is we took the direction from the vote last time and advanced it, and we had still maintained some of these different branches. And I do think that actually the discussion last time, as I'm recalling, especially informed by the Legislative Analyst's Office, was to defer to the legislature in the organization of the agency. So I do think we'll do both. I mean, it is both. It is both and that we're including all the things that you just read, Chair Moore, but not necessarily, not delineating out the different branches, which was a carryover from the original proposal. So that we've got that, we can take that direction and keep the same actions, but not delineate out the different branches.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm saying, I'm trying to reconcile the comments, and it sounds like we're not in conflict, is what I'm
Correct.
saying, you know?
Well, we are in conflict if you're saying that the
No,
branches need to be taken
Yeah,
out.
what I'm saying is, yeah, I'm just clarifying, basically, that I see both in here, and that there is no, they sync together, you know, and there are functions that are unique, that are not being provided for, which are assigned properly, I think, to the Freedmen's Bureau, and then there are oversight of very substantial California infrastructure, including CBOs, in which the Freedmen's Bureau has oversight and monitoring. So in my mind, that conveys the spirit of the resolution, but.
Member Grills, can you clarify your point? What do you think needs to be changed from what's been revised and presented by the DOJ based on what was voted on at our most immediate past hearing, not the January hearing?
To the extent that that paragraph at the bottom of page 6 is uplifted so that it is clear, it's a clear kind of framing of all of these different functions, I'm okay with that. And in terms of all the branches, I was saying that all of these proposed branches continue to reflect what was the original concern, and that some of these branches aren't necessary because, going back to that bottom paragraph, those things are happening already, and they could benefit from the oversight of the agency.
Well, no, that's not true. Because when you look at the branches, they have been updated. And so each of the branches, the first sentence says for each of the branches to provide oversight and monitoring, right? So for medical services branch, the first sentence is to a medical services oversight branch to monitor states' efforts to provide technical assistance for community wellness centers. That particular branch has been scaled back because if you really look at it and read it, it's only about mental health. It's not about physical health. It's not about public health. And again, oversight and monitoring leads in this branch. Same with labor and employment. Branch to oversight and monitor labor and employment. Development branch to provide oversight and monitoring of state-sponsored funded. All of these things have been scaled back, so to speak, to adhere to what you've been advocating for the past 2 times. I don't know if you thought that I did this, but it was the California DOJ that did it. So it has been updated to reflect what you want, which is oversight and monitoring.
I don't fully agree with you, but we'll see what happens when it gets to the legislature.
Sure. I mean, I personally kind of see this as problematic because when we talk about reparations, this Freedmen Affairs Agency, this is where reparations comes in. You know, I haven't been extremely vocal. Maybe we'll get there in the discussion in terms of the other policy recommendations that have been proposed by yourself and other task force members that are race-based and universal. I want to be clear, those are not reparations. Those are race-based and universal policies that the state legislature should be doing on its own, just because they're good policies to enact. But when we're talking about reparations, we're talking about policies that are specifically targeted to the beneficiary class that has been prescribed in the statute as descendants of freed African slaves. And we affirmed lineage-based reparations literally a year ago today. saying that those who would be eligible for reparations are descendants of free and enslaved Black people living in the United States prior to the 19th century. So, we'll get to the discussion, but most of these policy recommendations put forth are not reparations. And so that's why I'm a bit taken aback that there's been this constant push to scale back what is actually supposed to be reparations for the descendant community. So we're discussing right now the first part of the draft, which again is the introduction with the recommendations, the Freedmen Affairs Agency, agency transparency, and the other recommendations in the first part of the report.
Chair Moore.
Attorney Newman, you're recognized.
If I may, I just to respond, as counsel to the task force, we earlier today went over the UN principles on reparations, and the entire report is generated around addressing those and comporting with those UN principles. And one of the principles is guarantees of non-repetition. The entirety of these chapters that we're talking about right now are the guarantees of non-repetition. So these policy changes are changes that, whether they directly affect a particular eligible class or a broader eligible class or a broader class even of people who are not part of the program, they are a critical part of satisfying the UN's framework in terms of the guarantee of non-repetition. And so when this ultimately goes to the legislature as a recommendation that we've worked with the various advisory committees in developing, it is important to note that these are part of the repertory scheme that is being recommended by this task force to the legislature. So I just want to note that. And so some of these policies are being advanced in order to, redress some of what occurred, but the guarantees of non-repetition is a critical aspect of that. And just want to remind you that in compiling this entirety of this report, which will eventually be very lengthy and very detailed and satisfy all those elements, that is a critical element that the task force is satisfying through these policy recommendations.
And it's also important that we don't contradict ourselves in our own report. So in the section that we're currently discussing on page 4, it's the California DOJ who wrote this into the report. And that is as follows. Throughout the country's history, government programs designed to benefit the general public, i.e. universal policies, either intentionally or unintentionally excluded or minimized any benefits flowing to African Americans, especially those descended from enslaved people. When African Americans are not an exclusive focus of reparative policies and programs throughout history, they invariably end up at the back of the line and receive proportionately less of the benefits than others. So this is something that the California DOJ wrote into its own report. So are we saying that it's okay to contradict ourselves in our own report? No, we have to be nuanced, and what was written is true. When race-based policy, universal policies, descendants of slaves, we benefit the least. And so that's why, again, this report states this time has to be different. Unless someone is advocating for that part of the section to be deleted, which I don't think it should, because it's the truth. Member Scott Lewis, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair Moore. I think it would be helpful just for us to have the motion read, so that established what the expectations for the agency were. You have that? Thank you. So it was motion 3, and it reads, Member Grills made a new motion that amended the motion that passed during the January 2023 meeting. Member Grills moved that a new agency, CAFAA agency, be established that would provide those necessary services, direct and administrative, that are not currently being provided by any other agency, and oversight where services are already being provided with the option to provide direct services where necessary. It was seconded by Bradford, and there were no nays. So just so we have clarity on where we're coming from. Or rather,
My personal opinion is that motion is accurately reflected in the language of this draft report. Does anyone disagree with that? Member Holder, you're recognized.
Yeah, I would recommend that at this point, the DOJ just, briefly go back to the drawing board and make sure that the language is tailored, consistent with that motion that was made pursuant to the consensus of the task force.
We will do that. We will make those modifications informed further by this discussion and the motion and the discussions in the last meetings. And
Is there new consensus, though? Is there new consensus? Because this is the time to talk, this is the time to talk about it. Member Scott Lewis, you're recognized.
thank you. I think what we're dealing with is just an issue of language. And so I think what Member Holder is asking for is the right move to just make sure that the language is more precise. And really just reflects the motion that we all agreed to. So I think that does require the DOJ to go and refine that language further, make sure it is much more clearly stated, and then we will have a chance to look at that ahead of May 2nd. But we would have to then obviously finally vote on it on May 2nd. But my sense is that there is an issue of interpretation rather than intent here that I think, it's very clear. I've just read the motion aloud. Everybody is on board. And so I think, as Member Holder says, we just need to ask the DOJ staff to just try and, go back into the review. And I think the task force members should also provide their feedback in perhaps how that could be more precisely tailored to meet the expectations of the motion. But I don't want us to confuse intention with interpretation here.
And we certainly welcome, everybody's feedback if you have line edits or suggestions. And then, like I said, we have our team of deputies here who are hanging on every word, and we understand the feedback, and we'll be able to come back and implement it. And you'll see it in the next draft, and we'll be able to discuss it in the May 2nd meeting as well. But I didn't want to interrupt Member Montgomery's step.
Yeah, but we have to provide clear direction. So you're saying that the language needs to be clarified. Which language? What language are we talking about in this particular section that needs to be clarified? That's to the task force members. We need to be precise in our direction, otherwise we know what's going to happen. So what language needs to be clarified exactly in this part of the section? Do you all have a clear understanding of what language in this section needs to be clarified, Attorney Newman?
What I'm synthesizing it as is returning back to the last meeting where the discussion was more generally to implement in the fashion that Member Scott Lewis just read off, without delineating exactly how the agency should be organized, but rather focusing on the tasks the agency should be undertaking and recommending to the legislature that they organize the agency in such a way as to carry out those tasks based on the vote that was had. That's what my understanding is of that we're being told.
But to answer your question, Chair Moore, I think, so on page 4, I think, one example of a recommendation right now is that the language leads with oversight, right? And so I think what would be, but then it goes in the next, on the next page, and talks about the kind of provision of direct services, what might be a good edit is to start with where these direct services will be provided, to just try and make it very clear. And so I think, that's one. I mean, that doesn't change, I think, the principle of what we're saying in this, in this draft. But I think what we want are things that's more clearly stated. That, for example, the agency will provide direct services where they currently do not exist. We might want to try and add some examples of what those areas are. Then we clearly state, where existing services do exist, the function of this agency is to have an oversight role, to make sure, and those things are there. But again, I think it is just a question of how they're introduced. Some things are built into a paragraph with other things happening in it. And I think we just need things to be a bit more clearly laid out. And so that's what I'm saying. So the content isn't really, there's no problem with the content in my view. I think, and I think this is where Member Groves is coming from, is that it still is a bit blurry. And I think what we need is clear delineation of the two roles that this agency has. Where is this agency going to have the responsibility for providing direct services where they do not exist, and where does this agency have this oversight commitment? And that's what we all agreed on, pursuant to this motion, motion number 3 from the what was it, the January meeting? So that's what I'm asking.
We had a
for.
meeting March 3rd and 4th.
Yeah, but it was an update on sorry, you're right. So it was an update on the January meeting where we initially had the motion, and then was updated from the January meeting. But that's what I think we're getting at. So, because my sense is that you are fine with the language exactly as it is, Chair Moore.
Not necessarily, because again, we voted to have a full-fledged agency, not necessarily an oversight commission. Yet and still, when you look at the language of this draft, as you mentioned, oversight and monitoring leads throughout all of the different branches. And so, I mean, to be honest.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So it is an agency, right? We've established, and it says in the draft that it is an agency, but I think we just have more clearly stated the responsibilities of the agency. And so that's what I think is a bit blurred at the moment.
We have to also stay true to the vote that we made. And so remember Chris Alamo, who was the expert witness that the California DOJ brought in, he made a clear distinction between agency and oversight commission. So, I mean, I'm personally not necessarily satisfied with the language as presented, because it still looks like this is operating as an oversight commission, but at least in here, it reflects a motion that we passed March 3rd and 4th with the direct services where none exists. We didn't necessarily vote to scale back the direct services. We voted that there would be an agency to provide oversight and monitoring to existing state agencies and to provide direct services where none exist. So I feel like that is encapsulated pretty well. But am I personally satisfied? Not necessarily, because again, this needs to be my personal opinion needs to be a full-fledged agency that provides direct services even where it currently exists, because we know the institutions in this state, in this country, don't serve us. So why are we?
Sorry to interrupt, but that's what we did. That's what we have. And so, my point is that that's what we have. That's what we have. That's what we all voted on last meeting. What I'm saying is that the language needs to be improved upon to reflect that, right? So it's clear we all are. I mean, from last meeting, we're in agreement as an agency. We are in agreement that it will provide direct services where those services are not currently being provided, and that it would have an oversight function where services are being provided. No one is in disagreement with that. And so again, what I think is we have here, and this is why Member Grills brought this issue up, is that the language isn't clear enough. The intention in here is clear. However, you have to actually really read it closely to make sure you can kind of get a sense of the various moving parts. And so one of my recommendations is to kind of lead with, this is an agency. Its primary function is to provide direct services, and there are a list of the services and the areas of services, right? And then also to provide oversight. So I think what we need to see, because there isn't anything in principle that we need to update or amend, we just need to have the language better reflect the intention of the motion.
And if I could add that.
Member Holder, you're recognized.
Thank you. If I could add that, I think that at this point, we should embed the language of the motion from March 30th
Right.
in the text.
Absolutely. Okay, we will definitely do that. And I think what I'm hearing is this is really a matter, not a matter of change in the contents, but a change in the organization into two buckets where we're really hitting the nail on the head of what are the oversight and what are the implementation. Seems to be the feedback.
The language of the motion is embedded already. But, I mean, Member Scott Lewis, you're stating essentially what we voted on, which is correct. And I think I agree. We need to lead that this is an agency. Primary functions is to provide direct services, but also to provide oversight and monitoring. Member Gross, do you agree with that framing? That's what he said.
To provide direct services where none currently exists.
The whole point of what he said is lead with an agency with its primary functions is to provide direct services, I guess where none exists, and to provide oversight and monitoring. Do you agree with that framing?
Yes, where those services do not exist.
Okay. And so that's already in there. So, okay, we'll see what the California DOJ comes up with next time. Is there any other comments or questions around that part?
I have a,
Member Montgomery Steppe, you're recognized.
thank you. I think this will most likely continue to be a back and forth unless we, as a task force, parse out what we believe needs to be a direct service and what we believe needs to be monitored. And I think there's a difference of opinion in that. And so the motion is kind of open, especially with that last clause that we put in the motion. And I think there is a difference of opinion that probably we will, unless we do leave it up to you all, up to the DOJ to try to figure that out for us, I think there is a difference of opinion, because what the overarching theme that I am hearing is that this is going to be too big to do, it's not going to get done, so we need to prioritize. I believe that it's extremely big and huge to do and a lot of bureaucracy, but I just believe that there is not one agency, not one system embedded in the state of California that has done what it needed to do for descendants of enslaved people. And so I will continue to support the larger, more ambitious agency, because we've just seen it over and over and over and over again. And I am concerned about that. But at the very least, I may be in the minority, right? And that's just something that, we have to deal with if we go back and parse it out. Because there is a difference of opinion, I believe, on what needs to be a direct service and then what needs to be an agency that services are provided but monitored by the agency. So I know that's a long conversation, but I'm just hearing there's just too many different opinions for the task force DOJ to go back.
Attorney Newman, did you have something?
So we could do this a couple of different ways. First of all, obviously, yes, we definitely welcome the direction. We do think the more direction that's concrete like this, the better for us to be able to implement the final report. We could do this a couple of different ways. We can redraft that, make that a priority, redraft it, and get it back to you for your review and feedback directly to the DOJ in the next, by early next week. We could also, later in this meeting, we could create a couple of slides where we take out what's in the report currently as a direct service versus a non-direct service, and have you look at those slides. We can move that to the end of this particular agenda item. We can come back to it. Or do it in unfinished business this afternoon, depending on how long it takes us to put the slides together. And then you'll actually see it and be here and talk and have an opportunity to talk it through if you want that. Or ultimately, we could sort of put it together, working with you all over the next couple of weeks. It'll be in the final report, and we can agendize specifically the issue of the tasks of the agency in the May 2nd meeting.
Okay. I also just want to say I'm okay with what is before me right now, just based on the motion. I think it is true to the motion. I think the motion was kind of open-ended on purpose, and I also know that when we pass this over to the legislature, it will not look like this when it is passed. And so trying to cut all of that out right now is a concern for me, because what we give over will be chopped. And so I think the most important thing is trying to make it make sense, so that we have a continuity of services, so that, you know, when the negotiating begins, then there's still an idea of the framework of the agency. So, and I don't know if you all want to take that additional time, unfinished business, to discuss it, or, you know, that's up to you all. I think we need to figure it out, because we don't have time to revisit it again.
Member Scott Lewis, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Member Montgomery Steppe. So just so I'm clear, so starting on the second half of page 5 and going through pages 6 and I think 7, you know, there's a list of you know, services, you know, and so I'm just to get clarity on what you're saying, because we did, I guess, discuss, or at least we reviewed, you know, and we're reviewing now. So are you suggesting that you want us to add or update the current list of direct services, or are you not seeing these as being the services that you think we should be discussing?
I'm just reacting to what I've heard so far, which is that this is still, that there may be things listed on here,
Right.
that the agency is charged with providing direct services when there are already services available. So I'd like to know, that is not my opinion, but
Right.
but I'm open for the discussion to see what exactly those may be, because that's what I'm hearing from the conversation.
You know, so my understanding is that these listed items are the direct service items. I mean, could maybe the DOJ can confirm if that understanding is correct or not. And then there's a list of oversight.
Right.
Of
So
oversight, yeah.
Yeah, and earlier that I referenced, you know, I do think that there's a I think what we're talking about here is an organizational
Yes.
issue. And so we can take the same information, as Member Montgomery Steppe is saying, this does seem to, so I don't think anybody
Right.
disagrees, this adequately reflects the different roles and tasks that the agency is conceived to take on in the two different capacities. And so maybe a different organization would be to create two buckets.
So the 11 items that go from pages 5 to 6 are the direct services. And then the 6 or 7 items, I think, that are on pages 7 and I think the top third of page 8 are the areas of oversight.
That was our attempt to kind of implement the discussion last time.
Right.
That was our attempt to differentiate between what would be, and I think maybe what ended up, I think, maybe confusing it or having a little bit of a weird organization is breaking it up even further to specific entities that would be responsible for each and every one of these, instead of leaving that to the legislature to ultimately decide. So what I would say is, again, what I'm hearing is maintaining this idea of the two buckets, but just listing out the particular services or the particular oversight categories in and of themselves rather than getting bogged down in the organization.
Right. I mean, and so that's why so to that point, I think there's a need for this clarification, right? So on page 5, it says, in order to be properly vested with the authority to directly perform critical functions and services through the identified branches or offices, the agency should include at least the following. And it starts with like a genealogy branch and Office of Communications, and there's a financial components, and there's Business Affairs Office, and there's a whole bunch of those are the 11 items that are listed. And then after those 11 items, it says, we are not acting directly in furtherance of the recommendations of this report. The agency should be authorized to engage in oversight and monitoring of those state agencies tasked with engaging in direct implementation of recommendations. And it continues, and oversight and monitoring should include at least the following. And then it talks about, there's another, those are where the 6 or 7 issues follow. So I think, so again, it's clear that this is an agency. It's clear that this agency, has a responsibility of providing direct services, and those direct services are listed. It's clear that this agency also has an oversight responsibility, and the areas of oversight are listed. So I think what we need is just, again, just an editing and just a much more clearly stated set of objectives. And hopefully, this will satisfy everyone as of the next review.
And just for the record, I think that this reflects that. I think
Oh,
that
okay.
this reflects
All right.
the motion. I do.
Okay.
But also, more clarification is always good. That's not an issue. I just think that based on our discussion and where we all landed, this reflects what we voted on in our last meeting. I do. That's why I was asking the question, what doesn't reflect that?
Right.
So that we can go to that and figure and work it out as a task force. But if we're all, what does clarification mean, like of what? I think you guys have parsed that out. It's more semantics than it is
The DOJ structure.
what is here.
thing.
Yeah, I guess from,
We agree that what's on the paper reflects the motion that was passed. And I'm glad that Member Scott Lewis clarified, right? Those first 11 buckets, I guess you could say, are the direct services. And then the latter half, 1 through 7, are the oversight. So now it's up to the person who initially raised the concern, which is Dr. Grills, to look at numbers 1 and 11 in the direct services portion, and you should identify which of the 11 you think shouldn't be in there.
again, just to clarify from the DOJ perspective, what we're sort of hearing from the discussion is more of a focus on the tasks that are being undertaken, and less of a focus on the organization in light of the feedback that we received from the LAO. And I think Member Montgomery Stepp, reflecting that the legislature is going to sort of do what the legislature is going to do.
Could you repeat that?
Sure. I'm what I'm hearing is the reflection that more of a focus on the tasks themselves that this task force wants this new agency to undertake, less of a focus, or maybe removing, specifically weighing in on exactly the structure that the agency should have, with a recognition that the legislature is going to implement it in the fashion that the legislature is going to implement it. And that's what I was hearing from you. I just want to confirm that.
I'm sorry. Let me try to be clear. I believe that what we have in front of us, with maybe a few minor non-material edits, reflects the motion that we voted on in our last meeting. What I was trying to do was get to the root of the concerns that have been brought up while we were discussing this, and see if we could come if I could get a better understanding. And I think the only way to do that is to look at specifically at what is before us and identify specifically what does not meet the standard of the motion that we voted on. I don't have any of those issues necessarily to bring up at this point. I think from my recollection, from what has been read with regard to the motion and what is here before us, that the DOJ did the best job you could with a motion that was kind of broad and left us room for the legislature to understand what we're trying to do. But I'm only one person, right? And so as the body, if has any other additional issues, I want to make sure that those specifically are brought up in this space so that we can get to that. If they're not, then I'm okay. But I don't necessarily need anything else from this particular chapter. So I hope that makes sense.
Holder, you're recognized.
Yeah, I think what I would suggest at this point, so that we can move the ball forward, is that task force members who do not believe that the chapter is ready to go as is should be given an opportunity over the next few days to provide feedback on the small changes they would like to see.
April 10th.
April 10th.
That's been a rule this entire time, is April 10th. So small changes, though. So I don't know if that needs to be clarified. What's a small change versus a substantive change, just so for the folks who do have concerns, they understand that.
My question is, can we move on, or do we need to make a motion for that to happen? For us to engage that process that we've been using all along, to give people an opportunity to make revisions until April 10th.
Just clarify the types of revisions that need to be made today versus April 10th, just so for folks who have concerns, they understand that, so they're not blindsided.
We welcome everyone's feedback through April 10th. We will implement that feedback, and I think what we'll do is, like I said, we'll prioritize this issue to edit, implement edits, and circulate back to everybody so that everyone can see what those edits are. We can do them in track changes or some way to ensure that you see what those changes are, and we'll circulate them back to you all. So you'll have them as soon as possible. You'll have an opportunity to give us additional feedback before we craft a final draft that gets published. So there's
Qualify feedback. You have to qualify what you mean by feedback.
edits or disagreements with edits that get made. So we'll intake edits and changes that people make, and we'll circulate it back to the task force. And then I assume we'll have more edits and feedback from the task force, and we'll reconcile those for the final report. And then in that meeting, you'll have an opportunity to raise any significant concerns with the final version. But you don't need, I guess at the end of this.
Substantive edits don't need to be decided today. Substantive edits can be presented April 10th, substantive edits.
Any edits can be
Including
presented.
substantive edits.
Including
So
substantive
now we're
edits.
saying we have until April 10th to provide substantive edits.
Well, I don't know exactly, if you could clarify what you mean. I mean, the task force has voted on all of these recommendations. So we're set with what the recommendations are. If there is a recommendation that anybody thinks should be out of the report at this time, today is the day to make a motion to remove it, which would be essentially amending a previous motion that passed. So those rules would apply. So if you're talking about removing a recommendation, or substantially changing the nature of a recommendation based on what's already been voted on, that would be today. We're going to be, you all have a draft, and we welcome your edits. They can include, line edits, typographical edits, and if you have, some level of changes, I don't know that I have a specific description of what makes something too big to be dealt with in the drafting versus in a meeting. But obviously, if there is a significant enough edit that somebody else is concerned about it, it'll be raised in the final meeting. And then at that time, there can be a vote on reconciling it.
I just wanted that clarification because it's important that we remain consistent. So you're saying that, for instance, if there's concerns that some of these direct services need to be taken out, we have to decide that today, right? Correct? Or are you saying now the rule has changed and now we can provide those substantive edits by April 10th to discuss at the May 2nd hearing?
So if there are still disagreements in the May 2nd meeting, there can still be a motion up until the last minute to remove something. You all retain the right as a collective body to act through the finalization of the report. So today is the day, obviously, that we think we should be tabling and voting on any major changes of direction in the report. But you do have the ability to make a motion in that final meeting. It's just a matter of having already had motions that move these forward, what the threshold is for that motion to pass.
Can I speak? So we've talked a lot about this issue. We're now into 45 minutes. And I just want to go on record that I really agree with Member Montgomery Stepp. I've read this passage, these pages 5, 6, and 7 3 times now. And I think it accurately reflects the motion. I don't hear anybody on the task force asking for a superseding motion to replace the resolution that we did on March 3rd and 4th. And as I said in the beginning, I think we're all in agreement with this. And there's always ways to edit things to make them sharper, but I think the essential elements of the resolution are on pages 5, 6, and 7. So I think we're okay. I don't think we're in fundamental disagreement. And so I'm trying to smooth things over so we can move forward.
Thank you for that, Member Tamaki. Member Scott Lewis, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair Moore. Thank you, Member Tamaki. And in that spirit, I'm going to move to accept Section A of this chapter, California American Freedmen Affairs Agency, as is.
It's been properly moved by Member Scott Lewis and properly seconded by Member Tamaki that the task force accept the draft Chapter 18 introduction with recommendations. Well, let me clarify. Are you saying we're accepting everything in Chapter 18 or just the agency part?
Just Section A, just the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency.
Okay, thank you. So the motion has been properly moved by Member Scott Lewis and properly seconded by Member Tamaki that the task force accept the draft section on the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency. Is there any discussion on the matter? Hearing none, I'll turn to Parliamentarian Johnson for a roll call vote.
Thank you. I will begin the vote with Chair Moore.
Aye.
Chair Moore votes aye. Member Bradford?
Aye.
Member Bradford votes aye. Member Grills?
No.
Member Grills votes nay. Member Holder? Aye. Member Holder votes aye. Member Lewis? Aye. Member Lewis votes aye. Member Montgomery Stepp?
Aye.
Member Montgomery Stepp votes aye. Member Tamaki? Aye. Member Tamaki votes aye. Madam Chair, there were 7 members present and voting. There were 6 ayes, 1 nay. No abstentions.
There are 6 ayes, 1 nay, 0 abstentions. The motion carries as the ayes have it. So next to discuss are the other segments or sections within Chapter 18, Introduction with Recommendations. Any other comments related to the other sections in Chapter 18? I will say, the race matters quote, I think that we could find a more appropriate quote. So I know we have until April 10th to provide feedback on that, correct, Michael Newman, Attorney Newman? Around substitution of quotes and things like that?
So I think that the issue you're raising is a larger issue, and I think if you're going to broach the subject, it might as well be broached about the purpose of removing it and what you'd want us to replace it with.
Yeah, sure. No, I think that the quotes that we include in the draft report need to comport with what's in the statute in terms of the beneficiary class and the lineage vote that we voted on a year ago yesterday. So while I agree race matters, there are several quotes that center descendants of slaves, from Martin Luther King Jr. to Malcolm X, Queen Mother Audley Moore, U.S. Congress members that we can, substitute in there. Or, we can keep that in there, but put it in a section where because this is what we've been talking about, right? Like, yes, race matters, but we're under this system that the report mentions, where California has become a don't say black state. I think it's appropriate to have those types of quotes around race in the report. We just have to be careful how we do it, because we don't want folks to come away with this thinking that this is a race-based initiative. That's going to hurt us in the courts. And that's going to injure the victim class, who has said time and time again that this is about lineage repair. So I'm not saying that it needs to be out, but it needs to be restructured. Member Scott Lewis, you recognize?
Thank you, Chair Moore. I mean, I agree. I think I understand what this is meant to do, as an introduction to kind of help convey the import and the weight of what we're doing. But I think the language that precedes that section does that adequately, and the language that follows it is fine. I understand, I think, what the intention is with having, Justice Sotomayor being quoted to kind of give us some kind of legitimacy. But, I mean, we have a nearly 500-page report of the history of harms against African Americans in this state, the eligible community. I think, I think if it's a non-issue for most people, I would say yes. Let's remove it. I think, just so for clarity, and forgive me if I've forgotten. So where does this language come from? So there's this narrative expectation and requirement, and I think that that's what it is, right? And so I think it's important to know that this is not necessarily a policy thing. You know what I mean? This is just someone trying to introduce what we're doing. And I think what we perhaps should do is just make sure that in the language, when we're drafting this, the argument, we're making an argument, but we're making an argument based upon actual facts and history. We don't need to make an argument based upon conjecture, or at least I don't even think emotion at this point. We have a very well-established case here, a very well-established argument on a history. of torture that we've established, right, past year and a half. So I don't think we need to have something like this, you know, in the introductory language. Again, the paragraphs before, I think, do all of the kind of lifting and convincing that introduction needs to do. So that's fine by me. And so this kind of edit, I mean, this is a stylistic edit almost, it feels like. This is not a substantive issue, it's not a policy. So I mean, I think this is something that we can just give you line item recommendations on, right?
I think that's fine,
Over
yeah. I
email.
mean, some things, obviously, as we've worked through the version of this from the initial pocket briefs that we provided each of you on the various recommendations that the advisory committees recommended to sort of then narrowing that down to the outlines to then broadening that significantly into this draft. There's been different things added in, taken out as we've gone through. So certainly, like I said, through April 10th, April 10th is a good target date. We really would love to hear your feedback on edits and things like that. If we get a situation where one member is, suggesting an edit that we can trace back to another member's edit or drafting or preference, we'll endeavor to reconcile those two. But really, this is the kind of feedback we really want to get on the draft to make sure that the final draft that we present in advance of the May 2nd meeting really and truly reflects your collective voice and opinions.
Thank you. Because for clarification, this introduction was written by DOJ staff.
I'm sure. I mean, yeah. I'm sure.
So that kind of thing, I'm just trying to bring this up as an example. So that kind of thing, the task force can say, okay, you've used, the license of being responsible for drafting this thing as appropriately so, and here's our feedback on your use of language. So it isn't, I just want to make sure we're not trying to escalate it into a matter that requires motioning and so forth. I think just to try and know what we need to really spend our time talking about today.
And like I said, I mean, we don't know, I can't tell you today as we're sitting here, which components have come from either the DOJ staff found it or a member added it in or a member asked for it. So I won't be able to do that necessarily today on each of these things. But we're going to sort of pay attention to your feedback and follow your direction. And like I said, make sure we're reconciling with other members' feedback.
We don't need a motion to remove the quote. Attorney Newman?
Yeah, unless there's a strong opinion, no. I mean, we can remove the quote if that's your feedback.
Great, thank you for that. All right, so any other comments or questions, feedback related to Chapter 18, Introduction with Recommendations, repeal Prop 209, conduct racial impact analysis, agency transparency, and legislative findings? That's the last comment for me. And I think this applies not only to this section, but all the other sections. I wanted to just bring this up as a point of discussion. I understand, Attorney Newman, what you talked about in terms of guarantees of non-repetition, but I was wondering what task force members thought about structuring these recommendations. So, not necessarily deleting any of these recommendations because they're all great recommendations, but clearly categorizing them. So, universal policies have its own section. So the repealing of Proposition 209, that's a universal policy. That would benefit everyone, not just Black folks. And we want Proposition 209 to be repealed, but that is a universal policy. So, in this section, having a section for universal policies, having a section for racial equity, which, for instance, the California Racial Equity Commission could look to for their work. So all the race-based policies are delineated as racial equity policy recommendations. And then everything else that clearly says descendants is what we're calling reparatory justice policies. Just putting that out there. I think that's a great middle ground for, I think, everyone. That I think everyone could or should agree to. Member Montgomery Stepp, you're recognized.
Yeah, I also appreciate Attorney Newman and the wonderful staff that is sitting here before us, that we're kind of looking over here, and we know you're doing such a heavy lift here, so thank you for that. But I do appreciate the connection to guarantee of non-repetition. I'm still struggling with how to deal with these more universal policies, especially like repealing Prop 209. That was a recommendation we put forward, right? And I have personal stories around Prop 209. So I, get why it should be repealed. What I am struggling with is what we really call it, like where it lands on the spectrum. Because it does, the studies have shown it did benefit white women the most, right? And so we know that, although it did benefit African Americans quite a bit more, and we see the evidence of that. It's just not directly directly linked to our eligibility motion, right? So I am trying to settle that in my mind. I think breaking those out and defining, having those three different categories, as the chair just mentioned, is a good idea. I do not want to take these out of the proposal at all, but I do feel that they need to be defined for what they are, and a recognition that they are universal, in a clear statement or category that defines that. Also, just going back really quickly to the use of the use of African American, Black American, and I believe that has been defined within the document, but we need to, if not, we need to clearly define the difference that we are kind of going off of in the report. We need to define that. So for purposes of this reparation proposal for African Americans per AB 3121, this is how we define these terms. African American, Black American. I do, have some, if anyone has language, I have some language for Black American that we can throw out there that is more inclusive. Descendant community is a part of that, but it's not just the descendant community. So that's where I just want to make sure that even though we're just using that term based on the source material at this point, we're still going to be using it. So for the average reader, it still may look like an interchangeable term. That's all. Thank you.
Member Holder, you're recognized.
Organizationally, what we're talking about is an organizational restructure. And I think that organizationally, the way that we have put it together already is very intuitive and very logical, very systematic. And it shows that we have, just a sort of an intuitive, easily understandable methodology. I think that the structure, the organizational structure that we have so far is adequate, it's sufficient. And I also believe that, in our last meeting, we had a specific motion that said that the organizational structure is, that we all agreed, again, by consensus, that this is the correct organizational structure. We took a vote on it and came to a consensus. And so at this point, I would have to respectfully disagree and say that we do not do a motion to reconsider the organizational structure, and not keep revisiting what's already been done.
I have a clarifying question for Attorney Newman. So later on in the agenda, item number 22 is discussion and action item, organization and formatting of final report. So I think, Member Holder, you're saying that we shouldn't revisit, but it's literally revisited via the agenda item, which is number 22. And it's not structured as potential action, but action, which implies that there could be action around the organization and formatting of the final report. Is that a good understanding, Attorney Newman?
Yeah, just, exactly. So just to clarify, so there were certain aspects in the last meeting of the report that were not completed and were not evaluated and voted on by the task force. So there are certain things that are remained open that we mentioned coming out of the last meeting. So the vote today, at the end of the day, is intended to vote on those things that remained, just to clarify that they are confirmed on the organization and structure that was already confirmed. So essentially, we already have the overall organization and structure, and that has been voted on. And so this is a vote to complete the organization and structure with things that were not resolved in the last meeting. I'll just, as long as I have a moment, just to mention footnote number 11, I think Member Montgomery Steppe may address your concern, which is that we clarify the descendant definition, and we define it very explicitly by the vote that was held to define descendants. So it can be clearly delineated where recommendations are applying to specifically descendants, and there are a number of them, and then other ones that are not. But to Member Holder's point, the structure that we've had has been to mirror what was the interim report, which will now be the report on the harms, and so having the harms mirrored with the solutions to those harms and the guarantees of non-repetition to those harms. And essentially, different advisory committees had different approaches as to what was going to be included or not. And I think the discussion we had, I think 2 or 3 meetings ago, was the policy changes and were guarantees of non-repetition to the harms of the eligible class, but would not be to the exclusion of a broader class where it is too difficult to distinguish and delineate the eligible class. And I specifically recall a couple of examples. Minimum wage, for example, if you raise minimum wage for only one group of people, that means that group of people won't be hired because their minimum wage will be higher than anybody else. If you raise to, eliminate the death penalty for only one class of people, it'd be difficult to implement that, and you'd have to have people make disclosures of personal identifying information and submit to genealogy tests and things like that. So in order to avoid not creating a burden on the eligible class, some of these really don't have an alternative but to be stated, where there's a sort of penumbra of benefits outside of the eligible class, but the focus is still on benefiting the eligible class.
Chairman?
Member Scott Lewis, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Could you just clarify or confirm where this definition of eligibility is in the report so people understand where it comes up and then how it's referenced later?
I can read it. Footnote 11 in chapter 18 says in this chapter, that'll read in this part, descendant, in quotes, means African-American descendants of a chattel enslaved person or descendants of a free black person living in the United States prior to the end of the 19th century, pursuant to the task force's motion passed on March 29th, 2022, with a reference to the meeting minutes and a link to the webpage on which the meeting minutes are held.
Thank you. And is there anywhere in the report recommendations where it's explicitly stated the community of eligibility, or the community of eligibility is explicitly defined and the language eligibility and community are used?
So the community of eligibility definition was voted on as part of the determination of monetary reparations, and I believe in that chapter is where we specifically delimit the monetary reparations are only to be dispersed to people in the eligible class. So that is very clear in that chapter. And that, again, as we talked about with the experts, that's one of the reasons why it's very hard to come up with a particular number, because you're applying data points that are not necessarily delimited by the same definition, but to an eligible class of people that's going to be smaller than the overall population.
Yeah, thank you for that. Because I mean, 'cause it's important to just know what AB 3121 asks us to do, you know, and so, you know, in Article 2, if you go down to number 3, you know, task force is meant to recommend appropriate remedies in consideration of the task force's findings on the matters described in this section. And then you have C, you know, point C, which says how California laws and policies that continue to disproportionately and negatively affect African Americans as a group and perpetuate lingering material and psychological effects of slavery can be eliminated. And so in a way that is an inherently universal, you know, objective, right? So it's a question of the actual, of fixing, if not eliminating, the laws that currently exist. And so that's a separate consideration from a very specific attention on the eligible community. That's about fixing California's existing laws. However, that's followed by D, that says, you know, we are meant to, you know, make recommendations on how the injuries resulting from matters described in the subdivision can be reversed and how to provide appropriate policies, programs, and recommendations for the purpose of reversing injuries. And so there you have something that is actually more directed. And then in E, you know, how in consideration the task force's findings, any form of compensation to African Americans with a special consideration for African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States is calculated. So I think it's just important to know, and I understand that no one's suggesting that we get rid of the kind of universal policies, but what I'm trying to help clarify is that the notion of a universal policy, I would ask that we maybe change our framing away from a universally serving policy towards a set of recommendations that are meant to fix existing California laws, right? And I think there's a fine line there, but it is actually a very meaningful one. And so the task force does have the responsibility of helping to fix existing California laws that disproportionately affect African Americans. And so what that means is that these are laws that are for all Californians, but these laws disproportionately affect African Americans. And so I think, you know, I just asked the task force to kind of keep that, or I'm suggesting, right, that we maybe keep that framing in mind, because some of these laws are going to read universal, but they actually, you know, AB 3121 requires that we attend to these seemingly universal laws, because we need to fix them. All right.
Yes, Member Montgomery Stepp, you're recognized.
Yes, thank you. And that's a really good point. Again, I don't want anything to be removed, but I think even that delineation is important, even for our readers to be able to connect that. So that is one point. The other point is thinking again on that day, June 30, when we pass this over. What I don't want is for the legislature to see a way out of doing what they need to do for the descendant community and calling, you know, implementing some of these other things, reparations, when it wouldn't be an entire package that would be considered reparations. So that's what my concern is as well, that, you know, with something this big, you know, there are a lot of ways to get out of doing what the crux, you know, fixing the crux of the issue. And so I guess that's just something that we would have to monitor moving forward, but that would be just a concern that I want to raise. Thank you, though.
Member Tamaki, you're recognized.
Yeah, this is just to add to the discussion. And I think this could be done without reconciling these two different interests. And in some respects, in many of the chapters I'm reading that was drafted, the DOJ actually made those distinctions. For instance, on page 111, this has to do with a chapter on stolen labor and hindered opportunity. And I just point this out as an example. On the guaranteed income programs, I mean, specifically, it says descendants. In the second sentence, the task force recommends the legislature create a guaranteed income program for descendants. And so that's one example of a focus on descendants. And then in other paragraphs having to do with, you know, dealing with what Member Scott Lewis was talking about in terms of fixing a law, there's discussion of licensure requirements, in particular for that bar people from getting licenses if they have a criminal record. And there, you know, of course, we're talking about descendants, But in fixing the law, you know, you may not be able to be that specific. It's like the death penalty. Are we going to say just abolish the death penalty for descendants as opposed to, you know, the penalty in and of itself? So I think with some of these chapters, it's a bit of a scrambled egg as to where we can be specific in a meaningful way. Certainly on monetary compensation, there's a way to be specific, and the DOJ has done that, and been very careful about delineating those things out. So, although conceptually, Member Montgomery Stepp, I get this point about, you know, creating the separation into the buckets, racial equity, racial justice versus reparations in the true sense. When you go through the chapters, they're kind of like mixed up. Some of them deal with changes in the law, and policy, which Member Scott Lewis identified, and then there are other things that really are specific to descendants. So it's going to be difficult to keep, with every chapter, every paragraph, trying to break it out. So I'm thinking that the guidance to the DOJ is where it's practical and where it's possible to certainly delineate and specify descendants, and it's done that. And in the next edit, just continue to sort of look at that to make sure we're not losing anything. But on certain policies, for instance, Black babies in San Francisco, as 2021 data, have an infant mortality rate 5 times white babies. And so from a policy standpoint, legislative standpoint, I'm thinking, how do you implement a policy that would indicate we're only interested in saving descendant babies, you know? So it becomes impractical because lineage at that point makes it almost impossible to legislate. But with respect to policies, for instance, that promote and encourage and recruit students to go into medical school and a pathway, I think it makes sense to focus on descendants. That makes sense. And so I think the proposal, as I read it for UC Prime, is that it ought to augment its program to add a provision which focuses on descendant students. Things like that can be made to be specific without necessarily rearranging every single chapter and sort of dividing up the buckets so as to become sort of almost, as a practical matter, very difficult to read. So I think a certain amount of integration within each chapter is necessary that does both. You know, identifies descendants where we can, and where it wouldn't make sense or it would be very, very difficult, that we are careful about what language that can be best discerning. So that would be my suggestion. And I think we could do both. I think we can, without having to rearrange and break everything apart.
I'm conscious of time, and I think Member Holder was right to identify that this conversation is about organization and formatting. So I was wondering, well, I was going to suggest that we table this conversation for item number 22, and just continue to have the conversation around item number 19 around approving the sections within this particular chapter. So I'm hearing that we don't necessarily want to remove any of these recommendations. The question is about, like, how do we organize it or format it? But that's a separate agenda item, I'm realizing. So I'm suggesting that we just continue on in terms of entertaining motions to, you know, accept chapter 18, then so on and so on, as we were doing in the beginning.
Obviously, with the understanding that you have, till April 10th to provide any edits and feedback, and we'll be circulating back a final draft.
Okay. Member Grills, you're recognized.
Oh, I wasn't going to say, but I can go ahead and make a motion that we approve the sections B through F, is it? B through F, as written.
Second.
I second.
No?
It has been properly moved by Member Grills and properly seconded by Member Tamaki that the task force accept the draft Chapter 18 with the feedback around removing the quote, and but accepting everything else in terms of items B, C, D, E,
Chair Moore?
and F. Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Let me suggest this. So we voted on the California Part A because there was sort of a dispute and a disagreement and discussion. I think it doesn't sound like there's any sort of changing of direction. Sounds like we're moving forward with 18. So what I would suggest is, so we don't have to spend time voting on every single one, we just go through them and we can vote on any changes that you all give us direction on, and then at the end, we'll vote to submit and move forward with the entirety of Part 5 with, subject to any changes that have been voted on. So that way, it consolidates the discussion. So we can just keep moving forward. Everyone's on board with the rest of Chapter 18. We can move to 19, and then at the end, we'll just vote on all of it, subject to any changes in votes previously.
Makes sense.
Okay, you can proceed. Member Bradford.
I just want to be clear on what we're doing here. Are we still going to have the options to make edits and changes by April 10th based on what we vote on today? If there is a better way of delivering it legislatively, I pretty much tried to stay out of this debate because we do need clarity when it gets to the legislature. So I just want to make sure that we still have an opportunity to look at it one more time. And if there's some edits that can be improve what we have, we still have April 10th to do that.
So, the schedule from here on out would be, coming out of this meeting through April 10th, you'll have the opportunity to review, make edits to the version that we've circulated already. We'll take those edits in April 10th, issue back out a report by April, I think, 21st, which will then be discussed in the May 2nd meeting. You'll have an opportunity to review that and make edits, and then like I said, any major changes will be voted on in that meeting. Even after that, we still will have a little bit of time to implement any minor changes that don't differentiate from votes that were taken or direction that have been received in our final sort of typo review, site checking, et cetera, before we finalize it and send it to the publisher. So there's ample additional time to give feedback. The next so we can go, you all have in front of you the outline. So I'm just going down the outline. So Chapter 19 is enslavement. These are recommendations that correspond with the chapter on that atrocity.
There's a motion pending. They didn't move to it.
Oh, sorry.
Point of order.
Montgomery Step, you're recognized.
Just
I hear you.
This point of clarification, or never mind, just a suggestion. I'm not even going to couch it like it's formal. I think maybe we vote on the motion that's here, and then we vote on the rest of the chapters, like in one motion, but just vote on the motion that's on the floor.
You mean vote on the rest of 18 and then vote on each chapter, or vote at the?
No, vote on the rest of 18 and then vote on 19 through 30. Is there a motion and a second on the floor already? Okay.
We're continuing with the motion. It was moved by Member
Okay, you're
Grills.
speaking of the motion pending. Okay, would you restate the motion?
It was properly moved by Member Grills and properly seconded by Member Tamaki that the task force approve Chapter 18, the remaining sections B through F.
Okay.
Is there any discussion on the matter? Hearing none, I'll turn to Parliamentarian Johnson for
I
roll call
will.
vote.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I will begin with calling you. Chair Moore.
Aye.
Chair Moore votes aye. Member Bradford? Aye. Member Bradford votes aye. Member Grills?
Aye.
Member Grills votes aye. Member Lewis? Aye. Member Lewis votes aye. Member Montgomery Steppe?
Aye.
Member Montgomery Steppe votes aye. Member Tamaki?
Aye.
Member Tamaki votes aye. Madam Chair, there are 7 members. You skipped Holder. Pardon me? You skipped Holder. I do apologize, I know. I'm sorry, Member Holder? Aye. Member Holder votes aye. Madam Chair, there are 7 members present and voting. There are 7 ayes and 0 nays and 0 abstentions.
Thank you. There are 7 ayes, 0 nays, and 0 abstentions. The ayes have it, and the motion carries. We'll turn to the next for subsequent chapters.
So I think in the interest of time, it might be best if I just say, does anybody have anything else they want to raise in the remainder of Part 5? So the chapters on the policy proposals regarding all the rest of the atrocities.
So this is a matter of organization. I noticed in the racial terror section, there's a great recitation on mental health and mental health proposals. And I'm fine with it there. And I thank Member Grills for this contributions here because it's terrific. But I do note that in section 29, which is chapter 29, which starts on page 133, it's called mental and physical harm and neglect. And I wonder if we could just have a cross-reference to this chapter, pages 16 to 43, that have to do with mental health. And so there's just a cross-reference, and I think it fixes my concerns.
You mean a reference from chapter 29?
Yeah, when you get to 29, there's a section that says, on mental health proposals, please see, that.
So keep what's in 20 and 20 and what's in 29 and 29, but have a cross-reference from 29
Yeah,
back to 20?
I would, don't move anything around, just add a reference.
We can certainly do that.
Yeah.
I had a question for the task force members who put in the terms Black for different proposals. If they could clarify, like who would benefit under those proposals that say Black.
I think didn't we?
Member Grills, you recognize.
I thought we already agreed that we were going to go back through the document, and where it was not a direct reference to a quote or citation, that we were going to change the Black to African American.
So to clarify, that also applies to the policy recommendations, not, the other parts of the report.
Where the policy recommendation states Black, we could replace Black with African American.
Okay. So, great to know that that also applies to the policy recommendations and not kind of the other sections of the report.
So that applies to the entirety. The vote that you took earlier applies to the entirety of the report unless it's something like a data point that the tracking is, for example, Black, non-Hispanic, according to federal tracking. So those kinds of examples would not be changed, but anywhere else in the report where it is the task force's drafting and recommendations, it'll be changed to African American.
I think so.
Okay, thank you so much. And did we defined African American in the report? I know we defined descendant Or do we define African American in the report?
So in the interim report, I actually recall, it may have been you had a presentation where you had a definition of African American that was posted. I don't think that there was a consensus on that definition, and so it was not adopted.
So then I think there should be a motion to state that when we talk about African American, that's interchangeable with descendant, which is defined in the report.
I don't think that I think that the conversation that we just had about descendants as a subset of African Americans in the policies applying to, descendants first and then everybody else generally, I think that by collapsing those two, you would create a sort of internal divergence. I don't know that you can make them mean the same thing.
Member Tamaki, you recognize.
So one of the confusing points I have, and I don't think that this is a result the task force wants, in the healthcare section chapter, it talks about Black infant mortality rates and Black babies dying at 5 times the rate as white babies. So if we say African American babies, meaning only descendant babies, I don't think that's a result we want. In other words, that we are only going to take steps to stop the infant mortality rate for descendant babies as opposed to, the current language. And so I think that, I don't know how that's going to be implemented, for instance, by the legislature if we define it that way. I don't know how health agencies wrestle with that. I think it just becomes impractical and very difficult. Whereas, for example, the things like tuition-free college, things like that, or guaranteed income can be readily, you can define that as African American if that means descend down, or you can say descend down. But some of these other remedies be very difficult to parse it out like that. And I think it gets us to a result that we would not want, unless I'm misreading the room on that.
Yeah, I understand your point, but I think that's kind of a misreading of the recommendation. Even when we talk about Black infant mortality, the majority of folks, to be honest, who are affected by that are descendants of slaves. We're just invisibilized because of the way data is currently collected. But when we talk about all the different segments that we've been mandated via the statute to study, that is what we want. We do want targeted policies for African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. That's what the statute actually provides. Member Groves, you're recognized.
I asked this of Secretary Weber, but I didn't get a response, so I'm going to give it one more try. The way the statute is written, it's not clearly defined what is meant by special consideration. It didn't say exclusive. It said special consideration for descendants. And so to the point of Member Tamaki, when we go to look at some of the data, in all fairness, we don't know what percentage is just direct descendants and what percentage is non-direct descendants, and a lot of the social determinants of health data that we have available. So to begin to parse that out, it's to me going to be extremely complicated, and to be accurate and reflective of the data, we're going to be doing a lot of gyrations trying to be accurate. I don't know that that's going to be helpful.
That's part of the work, This is the challenging, hard work that we signed up to do.
But the data's not there, is what I'm saying. It's not It's not about us doing our work. The data is not there. The data that we have. It's not there. It's not there. It's not there. That's all I have to say. Yeah.
That's fine. Again, just going back to the statute, I shouldn't have to belabor this point, but the statute clearly states that we're supposed to study and develop reparations proposals that take into account of how federal and state laws have discriminated against formerly enslaved African and their descendants. Period. It goes on to say, we have to study and develop reparations proposals for other forms of discrimination in public and private sectors against freed African slaves and their descendants. It doesn't say all Black people. So we have to work with that. That's part of our mandate. Doing something outside of that would be outside of the scope of why we're here today. Like,
Chair Moore?
Member Skalowitz, you're recognized.
Thank you. Sorry, I stepped out for a moment. Come back. So is there a specific, I'm not sure exactly what we're talking about. I apologize. So is there a particular policy that we're talking about?
We're talking about, okay, so we came to the consensus that everything that says Black, if it's
Right.
not a direct quote from
Right.
source material, it will be updated to African American.
Right.
Now there needs to be a conversation around what does the term African American mean? And
Right.
I'm saying that we need to follow how African American is defined in the statute. And it
Right.
says African Americans are freed African slaves and their descendants. So if there's going to be a glossary of terms or something like that, descendant is already defined.
Sure.
African American also needs to be defined with the same definition as descendant by virtue of the lineage motion that we voted on last year, or it can be defined as it's defined in the statute that created the task force, which African American is descendants of freed African slaves in the United States, period.
Okay, so I mean, so a further question then is, so are you asking for like a blanket substitution or rather a blanket use of or definition of every use of African American to be in reference to the descendant community? I mean, if that's the case, then I'm asking a clarifying question about what's the purpose of the reference. So for example, there is, as I mentioned earlier, the bill says, fixing policies that disproportionately affect African Americans. Now, so would that then require that we only change policies that disproportionately affect the descendant community? No. I'm just trying to understand the terms here. And so, because there's a relationship between, where is it again? So when you go to AB 3121, and to be clear, they use AB 3121 does distinguish between African Americans and then African Americans who are the descendant community. It uses both. However, again, going back to CDE, in Article 2, C is how California laws and policies that continue to disproportionately and negatively affect African Americans as a group, and perpetuate the lingering material and psychosocial effects of slavery can be eliminated. So as I stated earlier, that is an intention to fix California's laws so they are not discriminatory. Then it says how the injury, so D then says how the injuries resulting from matters described in the subdivision can be reversed and how to provide appropriate policies, programs, projects, and recommendations for the purpose of reversing the injuries. That, to my mind, is a very descendant, a lineage-based, intention. And then E, how in consideration the task force is finding any form of compensation to African Americans with a special consideration for African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States is calculated. And so then there again is a descendant-focused thing. So I think the question is, we will have difficulty with C, because AB 3121, in terms of identifying laws, right, that and policies that disproportionately affect African Americans is using the more general category. But what the AB 3121 asks us to do is to actually create reparatory methods, policies, and so forth that specifically address the descendant community. And so my worry is that if we use a wholesale substitution or definition of African American as descendant, we actually lose the meaning of C, if that makes sense.
It doesn't matter because y'all not talking about the private. Y'all only talking about the public stuff. Talk about the private. The private
That's the question.
Talk about libraries and stuff. We need to talk about the private, which is like schools. These top Fortune 500 companies. Other than that, we ain't even gonna be able to get into a courtroom with talking about the private because they don't talk about it in public.
And just for the clarification of the audience and anybody watching, the task force has been given a mandate to provide remedies for state harms and the actions of the state. So that's why I think, going back to the earlier discussion that we were having about how to specify where and when we're talking, you know what I mean? We need to, and we can think about that when we get back to the, to I think number 22, we can think about how to more, excuse me, sir, can I finish? Thank you. We need to then be very clear about that. But I think there will be a confusion, and I think a legislative confusion. Right.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I understand. I have clarity now on. Okay, so I think that the descendant definition needs to be updated. The descendant definition needs to be updated, footnote 11, because descendant means what it is descendants of slaves. But African American, and just to bring into account what Secretary Weber said, she was quite clear in terms of the language in the statute, very, very clear. And so she stated that African American, with special consideration for African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States, classifies as a group of people. So African American is those who are descendants of free or an enslaved Black person living in the United States prior to 1900. In recognition that several people within the African American community were freed before the Emancipation Proclamation, were freed before the 13th Amendment, but still had to navigate a precarious society pre-1865. And so for African Americans living today, right, the statute goes on to state living African Americans, we are a part of that group. So, and we said, just to be clear, that those who would be eligible are African Americans, those who are descendants of free and enslaved Black people living in the United States prior to 1900. So that means all African Americans are eligible if you fit it within that definition. So if you can find an ancestor who was living in the United States, let's say between 1865 and 1900, you would be eligible for the broad-based programs, but if you can find someone who was actually enslaved, you're eligible for that compensation and everything else. So it seems as if descendant needs to be updated, the definition descendant needs to be updated to mean actual descendants of slaves, but African American needs to be clarified to accord with the definition laid out by Secretary Weber, which is African Americans are descendants of free and enslaved Black people living in the United States prior to 1900.
So I think, I think that, to be fair, AB 3121 actually has three three different terms, right? I mean, there's African American, there's African American with special consideration, in which special consideration is for African American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States, and then it talks about African descendants, which can be interpreted differently. I think what we should be understanding is that there's a principle where there is a direct policy and compensation that is seen as beneficiary, right? That we are talking about the eligible community, and I think that's what the footnote conveys. And so perhaps what I would suggest is that we pull that footnote into the main text. And again, reiterate, and then through the discussion around structuring, we need to structure each of the recommendations and the chapters where we are talking about attending to C, D, and E respectively. So there are ways that some of the recommendations are meant to respond to the disproportionate and negative effects against African Americans. There are components where there are policies and recommendations for reversing the injuries, right? And in that regard, to my understanding, we're talking about the eligible community. And then we have the compensation, which I think is the clearest, where we're talking about the eligible community. So I think, back to Member Tamaki's point earlier, we do need some guidance on structuring, and I want to take Member Bradford up on his volunteering of. I think no, he didn't volunteer, but I think it is really appropriate for for the representatives on the task force to really help help with the structuring, so that way we are very because we're writing this thing, and I've never had your job, sir, so I don't know what it's meant to read a document and to make use of it. And so I think if anything, we do need your guidance at this stage as to how things should be structured in a way so that we can fulfill the intent of AB 3121. But back to the original point, I think it would be confusing if we just have a wholesale definition of African American, because there are policies that are created that have been injurious in a way where the descendant community hasn't been necessarily the intended, or rather it is instructed in a way where it will actually, I think, be clarifying for the legislature of what it means to just think of these policies in that way, meaning existing policies, not beneficiary policies, not policies intended on reversing injuries. And so as Member Tamaki mentioned earlier, so fixing, what was it called again? The health thing for the doctors, the black doctors, UC Prime? Yeah, so something like that, which is meant to kind of reverse certain things. We are talking about descendant community in that way. So we just need to go back through and structure this in a way where we're very clear. Because right now the introduction says it, the introduction says when we say descendant, I think we just need a very strictly organized thing. So even within each chapter, we could even break it down into where here are the three areas, and these are the recommendations that fall under these three areas. Here are the recommendations within this chapter that are meant to benefit the descendant community. Here are the recommendations to update the laws so we get these reversals of the injurious quality of existing California laws.
Can I ask a clarifying question? So, a couple things. First is we keep referring to it as footnote 11. It is literally the motion that was made and voted on. So yes, it's footnote 11 and it's included and we can move it to language, but I want to be very clear. It's not DOJ added footnote or anything like that. That's the language of the motion and the definition that the task force voted on. So that's set unless there's a motion for reconsideration, which would require.
No, and it's moving it. So I think we're constantly having an issue with structure here. And the way that we're reading this in a way, in many ways, we need it to be a bit drier. You know what I mean? There's a lot of narrative, right? And I think that's opening the door for misinterpretation, or at least varying interpretations.
Well, I have a question for you, though, because every single recommendation is designed to benefit the descendant and eligible class.
Right.
So there's nothing that's not intended to benefit, and the language that we utilized was very strong, but they should come first. that there should not be another situation where they go to the back of the line or other people are generally benefited and then they get what's left over. It is so, I think, one of the questions that I have with you, and we've used restructuring and structure a couple of different ways.
Yeah.
What you're talking about is like, for example, Chapter 19, or that's a bad example, but Chapter 20, racial terror, where we may have community wellness centers in Black communities. That would be something that's not specifically or exclusively affecting or benefiting the descendant class. So that would be shifted, but having, some other policy that was specifically benefiting descendant class would be shifted within the chapter. I guess so what I would suggest is, I'm concerned about coming back here on May 2nd and having a reorganization that then changes the narrative of the entire report, where we are creating sort of escalating tiers of recommendations. I think the way the recommendations have been developed contemplates that every single recommendation will be focused on descendant class. Some recommendations will benefit more broadly, and I'm concerned about a reorg of each of the sections now may confuse or suggest that there are some that are intended to benefit the descendant class and some that are not or are intended to have a broader effect. The entire focus remains on the descendant class throughout the entire report.
So I think the issue is that there are, so if we go to AB 3121, Article 2, and we're looking at, I don't know how 3, right? There are ways that, within 3, there's 3A, how the recommendations comport with international standards of remedies. And so we actually have a chapter that talks about the international standards and how it meets that. But what we don't necessarily have is, a section or a chapter, a standalone framing that is really explicit and very clear, right, around how the injuries resulting from the matters described can be reversed. How the laws are being used to perpetuate disproportionately negatively African Americans as a group. The point is that the other issues, like how these things are benefiting the descendant community, they are built into the narrative and they aren't as explicit. That's kind of the point. And so when I'm saying structuring, I don't necessarily mean literally restructuring the chapter organizations. What I'm saying is that we need, and I think what's being called for is that within these chapters, we are more clearly stating who the policies are intended for. And there are other issues where, like the death penalty, we know that the death penalty is something that disproportionately negatively affects African Americans as a group. And so, however, that's different than saying we are going to create a specific, policy or program recommendation to benefit the beneficiary class of the injured community, right? Who is this eligible community? So what I'm saying is that those aspects are kind of written in a way where they can be overlooked. And I think what we're hearing, in this conversation is that that's not as clear as other things are. And so when I say moving footnote, I know that the language, that's the motion, but it's important, I think, for us to state that much more clearly, in the introduction, and to say, well, here are the recommendations, right, for the eligible community as so defined, and I think what we need is that kind of, there's a greater amount of, I think, concreteness around what we're talking about and who we're talking about when we're talking about them.
And we can also add in, Part 5, all these chapters are intended to address subdivision C and D in one, and they go to two different components of solving the same harm. So I think what we can do is we can really augment the introduction to Part 5, which is Chapter 18, which we've already voted on, but we can augment that and really elevate the purpose of all of these policies to make clear the benefit to the descendant class, that in benefiting the descendant class, it will have some of them will have a broader effect, some of them may. And then as we go through each of the successive chapters after that, we can, it sounds like you're saying, uplift specifically how each recommendation will benefit the descendant class.
Right.
We can do that.
And that it's intended to benefit the descendant class.
We can do that.
because it gets mixed up. And so because, there are these different terms being used, it then lends itself to, I think, confusion. And this is I think, Member Montgomery Stepp's point earlier, that by the time this gets to the legislature, then it can be very easy to get to a point where we don't know who, or they don't know who they're talking about. And so again, it's a structuring, So if we're talking about, environmental harms, for example, right? Here's a history of discrimination against, African Americans in the state. On this topic, environmental harms. Here are the state's policies that have perpetuated these harms. Here are our recommendations for fixing those policies. Here are the forms of restitution for the eligible community based upon those, you know what I mean? And so I think it's just that kind of thing where you literally kind of have C, D, and E as being more intentionally framed within how that is being structured. And granted, I know 9 of us wrote these recommendations in 9 or more different ways. And so I think what we want is, one, better alignment, but one that basically helps to structure each chapter, each recommendations based upon those chapters in accordance with the expectations of AB 3121, or at least how it lays out what the objectives are.
Yeah, we can take that feedback. I mean, I think that as I view it, this is feedback as to how to elevate this issue. We're keeping the same definition that's already been voted on. We're keeping the same language that's already been there. So I don't think there's a need, from what I'm hearing, for a vote to rescind a previous vote, but for us to take this feedback, modify the language, and then we can move forward.
Yes, because I think that's why, Chair Moore is asking for the definition of African Americans to be stated as she was recommending, because it can read unclear who the actual target population is. And so what I'm saying is that, given that, to Member Gross's point, that actually is very difficult, right? At least at this point. And we are recommending, and I really do encourage everybody in the audience and at home to read the stuff and to really be updated on what we're recommending. Because even in public comment this morning, a lot of the criticisms are actually things that we've done and are in the recommendations. So it is a bit frustrating to sit up here knowing that we've worked really hard on really listening to the community and building in these recommendations, and then the community doesn't read them. And, and I know it's a lot, trust me, I know people are at work, but we are really responding to community feedback. So I think, we are asking that more work be done, right, to collect data, right? We do know the limits of working on this task force for only 2 years. However, the issue is, I think there is an ability to get confused about who we're talking about and when. And, to Member Gross's point, due to a whole bunch of circumstances beyond our control, it isn't necessarily feasible to just do a wholesale substitution of a definition of African Americans. So, in lieu of that, what we do need to do is be very specific about when we're talking about the descendant community, when we're talking about existing policies that in a universal way are harming African Americans. And to be very specific, as we are with compensation, where the policies are actually meant to directly respond or to directly benefit the descendant community.
And, that does comport with the language of subdivision C
Right.
specifically,
Right.
which raises this point. So we
Right.
can certainly implement that.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? I think that's a consensus in terms of feedback, so no motion needed.
Yeah, the feedback is basically the move forward with what we have and, try to ground everything in just clearly benefiting descendants. And I think it sounds like we're just moving forward according to the original vote on using African American throughout, and then trying to ground it in descendant, but recognizing those two are not directly overlapping or synonymous.
Yeah, definitely grounding it, definitely. And so I think
Excellent.
in your revision, Chair Moore and Member Bradford, if you can, with a mind to making sure that, what we all have agreed to do is being represented, but then also is being represented in a way that can carry forward into the legislature, that would be really helpful.
I want to make sure we still have edit opportunities going forward. Okay, yeah, so we'll look at it.
So we don't need an additional vote on that. We can take that feedback, and I don't know if there's any other comments on chapters 19 through 29. 30, sorry. 30. It's very important, 30. Any other comments or feedback? So I think we can have a motion then to put that to bed, part 5.
I move to approve Part 5.
Second.
Properly moved by Member Scott Lewis and properly seconded by Member Grills that the task force accept draft Part 5. Is there any discussion on the matter with the feedback as discussed? Any discussion on the matter? Hearing none, I'll turn to Parliamentarian Johnson for a roll call vote.
Thank you.
Those parts.
I will begin with Chair Moore with the vote.
Aye.
Chair Moore votes aye. Member Bradford? Aye. Member Bradford votes aye. Member Grills? Aye. Member Grills votes aye. Member Holder? Aye. Member Holder votes aye. Member Lewis? Aye. Member Lewis votes aye. Member Montgomery Stepp? Aye. Member Montgomery Stepp votes aye. Member Tamaki? Aye. Member Tamaki votes aye. Madam Chair, there are 7 members present and voting. There were 7 ayes, 0 nays, and 0 abstentions.
Parliamentarian Johnson, there were 7 ayes, 0 nays, and 0 abstentions. The ayes have it, and the motion carries. The next item on the agenda is item number 20, discussion and action item, task force approval of draft report 10 or appendix, compendium of statutes and case law that contributed to an unjust legal system, prepared by consulting experts Dr. Marnie Campbell and Eric Miller.
So we have Deputy Attorney General Delbert Tron, who is going to present this item. This is the first time you're seeing it in the meetings.
Good afternoon, Chair Moore and members of the task force. It's a privilege to be here and assist with the task force's important work. Briefly, I'm going to give just context for the compendium and then invite the task force to provide any feedback or questions. In AB 3121, the task force is charged with compiling the federal and state laws that discriminated against formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants. The statute also asks the task force to identify how California laws and policies that continue to disproportionately and negatively affect African Americans as a group and perpetuate the lingering material and psychosocial effects of slavery can be eliminated. So to that end, our experts, Dr. Marnie Campbell and Professor Eric Miller, and their research assistants have been compiling federal and state constitutional provisions, statutes, as well as court rulings to document the many laws that have contributed to this discrimination, as well as identify potential laws that can be reversed. So generally speaking, this compendium tracks laws from 1850, the year of California's founding, all the way to 2020, the year that AB 3121 was enacted. The compendium is slated to appear as Chapter 34 of this report and is meant to supplement the very robust discussion of the history of harms already documented in the history of harms in the interim report that will be included as Part 2 of the final report. Generally, this compendium is divided thematically. The experts have collected these laws, provisions, and statutes in 5 general areas: housing, employment, education, political participation, and the legal system. But due to volume, the experts have not collected every single case or law that exists out there due to the breadth and depth of discrimination that has occurred in our state's history. And logistically, it would be difficult to publish that in the final report. So this compendium is illustrative, it's comprehensive, but it's not exhaustive. So for example, it focuses mainly on US Supreme Court and California Supreme Court cases, but does not include every single appellate court case or trial court case or municipal or local court case. And the same applies with statutes. It focuses on state and federal laws, but does not include municipal or local ordinances given to the volume. But again, many of those are discussed in the interim report, and those chapters that will be included in the final report. Finally, we are continuing to provide guidance to our experts in terms of the feedback from this task force, including, for example, the motion today. We'll provide them instructions to continue ensuring that the style and the terminology is consistent, for example, with the motion to ensure that African American is used as terminology, as well as any other motions or guidance from this task force. With that said, the DOJ welcomes any questions or feedback the task force would like us to provide to the consulting experts for the compendium.
Thank you so much for your work on this section, and to Professors Campbell and Miller. Are there any comments around the draft introduction for the legal compendium and the draft state and federal legal compendium? I think it was really comprehensive. Member Tamaki, you are recognized.
I just trust the DOJ will be site checking for accuracy on the compendium. That would be my main concern. And I'm happy to provide feedback. Thank you.
We definitely will be, and also welcome any feedback of anything that you all have. I think both the state and the federal, and we welcome your feedback on any additional cases that you feel like should be included, or policies or anything like that you should be added in, or if you have any questions or qualms with any cases, let us know. We're still working on exactly how it'll look in the May 2nd meeting, but the contents are essentially as they are.
My comment is, can these cases be organized chronologically? Because it doesn't seem like they are right now.
They're organized sort of, briefly, they're organized by subject matter areas in an attempt to try to make them meaningful in the context of what's in the report. But Del, do you want to?
We can provide that feedback to the experts and their research assistants. And again, we will also express our gratitude to them for their work, and they'll definitely be on that process as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the sections are fine, but maybe within the sections, organize the cases chronologically, I think would be helpful. Also, for the Dred Scott case, I was going to input a quote from that case as something that we could put in some of the chapters in the report. But in that case, they clearly define, who are the class of persons that were affected by the Dred Scott decision. So I think that definition should be included in the summary of facts and issues. And I'm more than happy to send that quote in the source to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. If there aren't any other comments or questions, we can entertain a motion to accept the draft legal compendiums. Member Grills, you're recognized.
One, just to clarify on that, the one point of clarification is whether or not this should be its own part of the report or an appendix. Because of the way we've sort of been working with the experts to get it into a more narrative form, our recommendation is to consider making it a chapter, kind of like we've made the Bunch Center a chapter and the Research Center's report a chapter. So keeping in line with that, so we don't have one thing off on its own as an appendix.
That sounds good.
Mm-hmm. And I was just going to, my original edit was for this document to be consistent with the rest of the report, that Black be capitalized, but now we're replacing Black with African American, so.
And to be clear, that should be capitalized, right?
Yeah.
Any other comments? Oh, yeah, motion. Oh, yeah, I just pulled up the quote from the Dred Scott. So it says, "It will be observed that the plea applies to that class of persons only whose ancestors were Negroes of the African race and imported into this country and sold and held as slaves. The only matter in issue before the court, therefore, is whether the descendants of such slaves, when they shall be emancipated, or who are born of parents who have become free before their birth, are citizens of a state, in the sense in which the word citizen is used in the Constitution of the United States. And this being the only matter in dispute on the pleadings, the court must be understood as speaking in this opinion of that class only, that is, of those persons who are descendants of Africans who were imported into this country and sold as slaves."
Good addition.
So are you asking for that to be included in the compendium?
Yeah, I think that should be included in the compendium, where it's the summary of facts and issues. It clearly defines the class of persons they were talking about. But I also think that quote should be in some of the other chapters in the report. I know that was like a recommendation for us to provide quotes that could correspond to the different chapters. So I guess I'm recommending that particular quote is updated in the summary of facts and issues for the legal compendium, but then also I'll have to look over the entire report to see where that quote can also be added in another section as well. Because I think that really grounds us in terms of who we're talking about and what reparations should be for. As you all know, this was decided in 1856, so. 1857. So, is there a motion to approve the legal compendium with the feedback that we just provided? Is there a second? Second. It's been properly moved by Member Montgomery Steppe and properly seconded by Senator Bradford that we accept the draft state legal introduction of the compendium with the feedback as we just discussed. Is there any discussion on the matter? Hearing none, I'll turn to Parliamentarian Johnson for a roll call vote.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will begin the vote with Madam Chair.
Aye.
Madam Chair votes aye. Member Bradford? Aye. Member Bradford votes aye. Member Grills? Aye. Member Grills votes aye. Member Holder? Aye. Member Holder votes aye. Member Lewis? Aye. Member Lewis votes aye. Member Montgomery Steppe? Aye. Member Montgomery Steppe votes aye. Member Tamaki?
Aye.
Member Tamaki votes aye. Madam Chair, there were 7 members present and voting. There were 7 ayes, 0 nays, and 0 abstentions.
Thank you. There are 7 ayes, 0 nays, and 0 abstentions. The ayes have it, and the motion carries. So the next item on the agenda is break. We're a bit behind, so I do still think we should get a break, though.
Can I say one thing
Yeah.
before we break?
Yeah.
I just want to commend the Department of Justice, all the lawyers here, and some of them are not here, and Michael Newman. The work that's been done in general the quality is excellent. And I just want to say that, yes, please give it up for the DOJ. I just want to say that if the lawyers and the other staffers didn't have their heart in this, it would be reflected in the quality. This quality of this work is going to stand up, and stand the test of time. It's going to be looked at by scholars across the country. I predict it's going to be known as the California Report or something like that. And I just think it's just a wonderfully written, researched, reasoned analysis and compilation. And the narrative is terrific. The organization, subject to, of course, our brilliant edits, is great. And I want to thank Michael Newman for guiding this process. I think it's really well done, so bravo. Yeah.
Thank you. you so much for that. So we'll now go to break. We'll return around, unless we want to continue. Okay, so we will go do a 15-minute break. Oh, no. Okay. So I'll now turn to Parliamentarian Johnson to reestablish a quorum.
You ready? Okay. Madam Chair,
Present.
Madam Chair is present. Madam Bradford? I'm sorry. Member Bradford is absent. Thank goodness. Member Grills? Member Grills is present. Member Holder? Member Holder is present. Member Lewis? Member Lewis is present. Member Montgomery Stepp? Member Montgomery Stepp is absent. Member Tamaki? Member Tamaki is present. Madam Chair, there are 9 members on the task force. You need 5 to have a quorum, and you have 5 present. You have a quorum.
Thank you so much, Parliamentarian Johnson. Now that a quorum has been reestablished, we'll turn to the next item on the agenda, which is item number 22, discussion and action item, organization and formatting of the final report. We're all clear on that? Okay, so now that we're all clear on that, we can turn to agenda item number 23, discussion and action item, future meeting dates, locations, and agenda. So right now, we have two more public hearings until the task force is set to sunset. Our next hearing is tentatively scheduled for Tuesday, May 2nd in Sacramento. And then the final hearing would be June 30th. Location, we haven't decided yet. So is there any discussion around those two hearing dates and locations? Scott, oh. Member Scott Lewis, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair Moore. Yeah, I mean, I think I want us to try and honor the community's request to try and hold our meetings on the weekend. I mean, it's evident that it's been difficult and, you know, a great cost to people to show up here for these past 2 days in the middle of the week. And so I want to, you know, ask my colleagues to consider moving the meeting from May 2nd to May 6th with location to be discussed. I believe there are some restrictions on members' availability based upon location on May 6th. From my understanding, holding that May 6th meeting in the East Bay would make it possible for all committee members, task force members to attend the one-day meeting on May 6th.
Thank you. Want to entertain a motion around it? Or do we need a motion?
Yeah, I think we need, but we need to discuss the next meeting and the following one. And can these be 2 separate motions, or should we discuss both dates first, or both meetings first?
Yeah, you can make a motion on both and do a discussion on both at the same time,
Okay.
if you want. But make clear exactly what you're suggesting to do.
Yeah, and so just continue the
Thank you.
discussion. You know, I think it's really important at this stage, you know, especially as we gratefully, but still sadly, wrap the task force that we make sure that we have as great community attendance and engagement as possible. And so I would also suggest that we hold our final meeting in Los Angeles, our June 30 meeting in Los Angeles.
What I'm hearing is we changed the May 2nd date to Saturday, May 6th in the East Bay, and then our final June 30th hearing in Los Angeles.
That's right. And I say the East Bay because I know that, there will be some need for the DOJ to work out the logistics as to exactly where, we will hold the meeting. So that could be, Oakland, I think, but also, anywhere that it would be right there. So, but I think Oakland is the ideal location. But I think that opens us up to holding it in Richmond, but I think that's, East Bay is, I think, is as precise as perhaps we can be at the moment.
Yeah, we would not have yet. We'd have to figure out a location that's available on a Saturday.
Right.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
So a couple questions. So with respect to the final meeting on June 30th, I recall a discussion from, with respect to Senator Bradford and Assemblyman Joan Sawyer, that there was conflict where they had to be available for a vote. And that was the reason why it was designated to be in Sacramento. Has that changed?
They had to be in Sacramento May 2nd.
May 2nd?
May 2nd.
But they're available.
I
Yeah,
don't
it-
think that we've confirmed whether they're available or not, and then I don't think that we would be able to know, and we'd have to figure out availability of, dignitaries that the task force would want to invite. Obviously, in Los Angeles is going to be more difficult than in Sacramento, for example.
So we're a little bit handicapped here because, out of 9 members, we've got 5 present. I'm wondering, one way to do it, could it be a conditional vote to basically say subject to the attendance, a confirmation of attendance by every member with respect to both the date and location?
So you can bifurcate it, and we could settle May now, and we could say that we could have discussion where there's a preference for June 30th in Los Angeles, pending confirmation of the other members. But that's sort of more of a discussion point and not resolved, and then it'd have to be voted on in the next meeting to set the June 30th meeting in whatever location works.
So have we confirmed that May 6th, everybody can attend?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, okay.
We have. Everybody can attend in Oakland on May 6th,
Okay.
Saturday. East Bay, sorry. East Bay. Yeah, May 6th, East Bay, and then theoretically, we'll figure out and we'll report back in the next meeting. June 30th is a date, but the location is still TBD.
I was wondering, in terms of conditionality, could we toggle with Friday, June 30th and Saturday, July 1?
The challenge with July 1 is it's a new fiscal year. And so sometimes there can be issues with the ability to travel and hold meetings and do government work, work on that day. So June 30th is the safer day.
Okay, thank you for that. And so I think there's consensus, and then I guess we could follow up with a motion of consensus that the May 2nd date be changed to May 6th, and the location be changed to East Bay, and then the June 30th hearing be in Los Angeles.
You don't have to, you're saying you're setting the date in you're setting it in Los Angeles on June 30th?
We don't know that.
You don't have to set it. You don't have to set that location.
We haven't confirmed that everybody's available to be in LA.
So it's only Saturday, May 6th, right now, in East Bay.
Okay, and then we'll revisit the June 30th location, May 6th.
Yeah. Okay. So I move that we hold our next meeting on May 6th in the East Bay.
Second.
It's been properly moved by Member Scott Lewis and properly seconded by Member Grills that our next hearing be May 6th in the East Bay. Is there any discussion on the matter? Hearing no discussion, I'll turn to Parliamentarian Johnson for a roll call vote.
Thank you. I will begin with Chair Moore.
Aye.
Chair Moore votes aye. Member Grills? Aye. Member Grills votes aye. Member Holder? Aye. Member Holder votes aye. Member Lewis? Aye. Member Lewis votes aye. Member Tamaki? Aye. Member Tamaki votes aye. Madam Chair, there were 5 members present and voting. There were 5 ayes and 0 nays and 0 abstentions.
Thank you. There are 5 ayes, 0 nays, 0 abstentions. The ayes have it, and so the motion carries. The next item on the agenda is item number 24, unfinished business. No unfinished business, so the next item on the agenda is the meeting has been officially adjourned, and we will see you all next time, Saturday, May 6th in the East Bay. Thank you so much.
I think we're going to put it up on the agenda, but the next meeting's agenda is to vote on the final report. So I don't know that we really need to put it up, but basically the only agenda items that'll be on the next meeting is voting on the final report. It will highlight any changes I mentioned earlier, and you'll vote. Yes.
So how long do you think that's going to take? I know it's just a day meeting, but.
That's
it? Oh, this is it. It's on here.
all up to you all. I could. So it would be the standard 2 hours of, not standard, but 2 hours of public comment. Then we would have 2 blocks of voting on the final report, 3 blocks, and conclude business. So we're proposing to start at the standard time and finish at the standard time, but if everybody's reviewed the report and is okay with the report to move forward to final polish, it might not take that long.
So I know we don't have to do a motion for this, but what do you all think about having 3 hours of public comment for the next 2 hearings? So it's like 2 hours in the morning and then 1 hour after lunch.
What?
Your microphone's on.
Can I offer something else too?
Yeah, Member Tamaki.
This is the last hearing, obviously, and we will have a finished final report. Is that right?
Final report, but not necessarily finished. It won't be formatted. It won't be.
Okay.
This is for May.
But this
6th,
is
yeah.
like the grand announcement. And so I think we should be thinking about a major news media and explanation of the body of the report and roll that out briefly. I mean, not something that goes on for 2 hours, but something that is concise and explains to the public and the news media what we've done for the past 2 years. It'll help the legislators understand the meaning of it. And if we could get a national focus, that will also be good. And so this is something that, we'll be in contact, obviously, with Shauna Charles about, but I think that is a really important use of the time. In other words, if the meeting is, we approve the final report and let's adjourn and thank you, that's probably not a good way to end, in my view. I think we should have something going on. I think there may be some ceremonial aspect as a media, to get media attention. Maybe something symbolic happening at that time. And rather than prolong the public comment, which is 2 hours is long, I would really want to fill that time with something that brings out, in a succinct, punchy way, the meaning of the report, what the California has done, and what the path forward is, something like that.
Chair Moore?
Member Scott Lewis, you are recognized.
So could I ask what the June 30 meeting is meant to look like and what activities are meant to take place? And how much time those activities?
The June 30 meeting was contemplated as being extremely short and basically unveiling formal presentation, potentially, dignitaries there to accept the report, make remarks about the report. Theoretically, it could be that, but the June 30 meeting is really the closeout, and that's the formal gaveling out and final remarks from the members, things like that in the final meeting. If you were to do something like this, the one thing that I would encourage is, we have 9 components of the report, and we have 9 members. So if you wanted to do something like that, Don, we could have each of the members sort of do a presentation on a component of the report. If you wanted to sort of lead out with the discussion of what's in the report, and that would allow for that kind of feedback or output to the public that really goes through all the different components of the report.
Yeah, again, I'm just thinking out loud on this. I'm not advocating for one position or another. But for instance, the public comment now shifts to not what the task force should do, but rather what the legislature should do, right? That's what I would expect. In other words, the public comments have frequently focused on, the task force focusing on lineage and eligibility. Those comments would be now directed toward the legislature and, forward thinking about, okay, now let's do something. And I would think that the task force members, of course, would want to say something. And I would think it would be couched in a way to get maximum coverage and also explain to the public clearly what this is about. I mean, many people, maybe most in the public, think reparations has one element, money. And actually what we're talking about is direct compensation for sure for descendants, but an array of proposals that covers the whole landscape of the 13 chapters. So whatever we can do to further that understanding, and so the press has a clear understanding of that, I think is really, crucial. And, it's got the imprimatur of the state of California. This is a big deal in my mind, and this has not been done before. We're doing this for the first time anywhere. And so I think there's a way to make this very newsworthy, and meaningful, but it would have to be in conjunction, I think, with communications, professional advice and all that. But that's kind of the thing I'm envisioning.
And so my question is, so are you proposing, I agree with this, we need to do this.
Yeah.
But I think my question was, on which of the days would it be appropriate? Because my understanding is that you're suggesting the May 6th meeting, we have time to do this. But I'm wondering if the June 30, when we do actually have the...
I'm thinking June 30th.
Okay.
And so the
yeah.
May 6th would be the run-up.
Right.
That would be like the priming
Yeah, okay.
the interest. And then the June 30th
Okay.
would be here it is.
So you're not asking for time on May 6th to do this? You're suggesting that we do this on June 30?
Yeah, I think we may have a lot to consider actually on May 6th.
Yeah,
I'm
okay.
hoping that we can fit it all within the time.
Okay.
And then June 30th would be we call it ceremonial, but it's really to inform what we've done here.
Right.
And if we do it, we need to do it in a meaningful, impactful way.
I would then suggest that we put in an agenda item for May 6th, where we can talk about what we'd like June 30th to look like. Let's give ourselves an hour, or at least 45 minutes to have a conversation about what June 30th should look like.
We can remove DOJ updates
Yeah.
to make room for that important discussion.
Okay, is there anything else that satisfies substituting the DOJ updates for a discussion around what we want June 30th to look like, particularly as it relates to media? So that seems to be the consensus, so we'll do that. All right?
And so that would kind of also encapsulate, I don't know why the numbering started over again, but, so discussion action item on June 30, so that would also take part, that would be a part of that discussion, right? So.
Yeah, so you'd be looking at, the last agenda item would be, instead of DOJ updates, and I mean, we still have meeting location and agenda, and probably if you want to make it an hour, if you want to block off an hour, we can pull time from the
Yeah, so
discussion.
points 1 and 2 at the bottom would just be this, kind of discussing of June 30.
We'll make sure there's an hour at the end to do that.
Okay.
So basically, the rest of the agenda as is, and we'll figure out breaking up things into lunchtime and break time, and then make sure there's an hour at the end to talk about what the plan will be for June 30th. Okay, we can do that.
You need a motion?
Can I entertain a motion around what's been discussed?
Somebody do it.
I'm sorry, who seconded the motion?
I don't think a motion has been
No
made yet.
one advanced the motion. Lisa's about to advance it.
Okay, Member Holder,
Member Holder. It's almost 5:30. So.
No, I move that we dedicate the last item of the agenda on May 2nd to focus on a discussion of the June 30th meeting and what we would like that final meeting to look like. And we dedicate at least an hour at the end of the agenda to discuss that.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's been properly moved by Member Holder and properly seconded by Member Scott Lewis that we update the May hearing agenda to substitute out the DOJ updates for a section, at least, you should say an hour or 45 minutes to discuss what we would like the June 30th hearing to look like. Is there any discussion on the matter? Hearing no discussion, I'll turn to Parliamentarian Johnson for roll call vote.
Thank you, and again, I will begin the roll call for the vote with Chair Moore.
Aye.
Chair Moore votes aye. Member Grills. Aye. Member Grills votes aye. Member Holder. Aye. Member Holder votes aye. Member Lewis. Member Lewis votes aye. Member Tamaki.
Aye.
Member Tamaki votes aye. Madam Chair, there are 5 members present and voting. There were 5 ayes, 0 nays, and 0 abstentions.
Thank you. There are 5 ayes, 0 nays, and 0 abstentions. The ayes have it and the motion carries. The meeting is officially adjourned.